Ladies and gentlemen, independent Americans around the country and around the world, we are going to continue to focus on Ukraine, national security, military affairs in a way, frankly, that most media shows don't and should. I think there's nothing more important. There's nothing more urgent. And I am very privileged, humbled, and thrilled to welcome back to the podcast one of the best voices on all these issues and much more. The great and powerful General Barry Mccaffery is back on the show. Welcome back, sir.
Well, good to be with you, Paul.
Sir, it's been, last time you were on was 2 years ago, so I hope we can have you on more often in the days ahead, because national security should always be front and center. I want to talk to you about Ukraine. I'd love to get your thoughts on China and the general state of the world. But just a baseline question I ask everyone: where are you, sir, and how are you?
Well, I'm in Seattle, Washington, home. All three of our adult children's families are out here, and very happy about it. It's a beautiful part of the country, lots to do, sports, water, activities, skiing. It's really a glorious part of the country. So all is well, and family is central in our life.
Sir, can I just build on that and ask you, because I'm a father of two young boys, and you have always prioritized your family, and I look at you as a role model and an inspiration. As you get to become a grandfather and you reflect on all of this, do you have any lessons learned or advice or wisdom as a family man on how to keep your family strong and happy and well?
Well, that's a new question for me. First of all, I think all kids are different. The environment is different for children. The family circumstances. You have an intact mom and dad. They go into a great high school. Teenagers are a huge challenge. What I tell parents there: don't ever give up. Don't let go of them. I said Sunday was church, an event. You're staying with your parents on Sunday. Frequently, it was like having Muammar Gaddafi along for the ride, but all three of our kids grew up to be these outstanding adults, and they married people just like them, and now their families are doing well. So there's a lot of luck in life, but I think strong, committed parents and grandparents makes a difference.
I so appreciate you sharing that, and I think that's valuable insight, especially as we all try to help navigate our families through these challenging times. I want to get to Ukraine and the state of affairs there in particular, but can I ask you, and I'm going to ask you this every time we talk, how's America doing? Where are we as a country, and what are your thoughts and reflections on where America is right now?
Well, on a standard presentation, I'm talking to a Rotary Club. I love Rotary. I start with, here are the good things about America, and they are unending. I mean, the agricultural output of America, the complexity and integrity of our business community, the size of the armed forces, the goodness of the American people is legendary. I'm discouraged. I think the political leadership and the endless political war over every issue and the irresponsibility, mostly of the Republicans in the House, is what I would seize upon. But, there's goofy stuff on the left also. So I think the American people are disenchanted, and they're increasingly likely to listen to anti-democratic authoritarian voices. It really scares the pants off me. So 2024 promises to be another gigantic, dangerous confrontation of angry people on the left and the right. We got some challenges that are unique since the Civil War, since 1865.
Sir, digging deeper into that, as these challenges rise, we've talked a lot about the opportunity for independent voices, in particular coming out of the military. I think there's a lack of trusted leadership with authenticity and integrity, but you're kind of the prototype of what we hope would be a candidate, someone who isn't partisan, who puts country first. You never ran for office yourself, at least that I know of. Do you see an opportunity for people like you, or even the generation younger than you, to carve out some kind of a space between those warring factions and to move our country forward? How do you feel about that opportunity for independent-minded people?
Well, of course, there are increasingly, thank God, there's some Afghan and Iraq vets that are showing up in politics across the country in both parties, not just in the Congress, but also as county executives and city councils. And these are some good people, and they understand America because they served it. And in general, 60,000 killed and wounded fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. So these people put it on the line. So I think that's somewhat encouraging. I always like to tell what I think is an amusing story. The Democrats came to recruit me to run for the Senate when I left being the drug policy director. I was a nonpartisan figure, but they figured, they wanted me to run against Senator Warner, this wonderful World War II Korean, Vietnam veteran, lovely man, family friend. And several of them came to me and they ran some polling thing. They said, we think you can appeal to his audience and you can beat him. And I said, well, that's okay. So I assembled 3 long-term Virginia voters. We were voting in Virginia at the time, my sister, my wife, and my dad. And I laid out the pros and cons of running for the Senate against Warner. And they said, well, at the end of the presentation, I said, do whatever you want, but we're voting for Warner. So my potential political career came to a grinding halt. As a general statement, I think the senior military people aren't very good political candidates for a variety of reasons. That's not being demeaning either to the military or to politics, but the tendency is more on effective, rapid decision-making and selling it to your organization. You still have to sell it. Whereas in politics, I think a lot of it's the art of the possible and being ambiguous on where your actual position is. And so, the senior military generally don't do well at that in my experience.
We've had you on before. We've had Admiral Mike Mullen on. We've had Admiral Stavridis on. We've had General Hertling on. A lot of folks that have been independent in leadership and in the public dialogue for a long time. I know I speak for many of us where I feel like if we could get everybody together, if there was the spirit of Colin Powell and the spirit of John McCain and this sense of patriotism, that there is a real hunger, if not an elected office, for some kind of a galvanizing. And I think we saw that maybe in the later days of the Trump administration where folks came off the political sidelines. Is there anyone that could do that? Is there anyone that is apolitical or independent? I'm thinking of Mike Bloomberg and others. Is there anyone that you think could bring those folks together to try to rise to this moment from the center or from outside of the traditional 2-party system?
Well, that's such an important topic. Right now we've got Mr. Biden, who I know quite well and have a lot of respect for. And he's 80 years old, for God's sakes. It's way too old to be running for office again. Well, on the other side, we've got the potential for Trump, an utter disaster for the country. Are we going to end up with the two of them as our candidates again? There's 330 million people in this country, for God's sakes. You and I meet people during the year, 250 a year, that would be a terrific president of the United States. Some of them have political background, like, Amy Klobuchar, but others are running universities and small companies, and they're in nonprofits. They're spectacular men and women all over this country in both political parties. Some of the governors are first-rate people and could be potential candidates. And yet here we have both parties proclaiming all they've got are these two possible candidates. It is a shameful situation. We need men and women of courage and integrity to step forward and run for office, not just the presidency and Congress, but at every level.
I want to put that in a TV commercial, and you're kind of recruiting for none of the above, which I think is, continues to be a barrier. We both know, especially so many young leaders who want to get involved in politics, but they don't want to join a party. or they don't want to do the fundraising, or they don't want to go through that compromising process. And I think there's a generation of politically homeless that are looking for that galvanization. I hope that we can be a small part of it in these conversations, and your leadership is key. But I'm going to ask you to shift from that. And I should also add, I knew Senator Warner. He was fantastic. He was a leader for us on the GI Bill with Senator Jim Webb when you had a Democrat and Republican working together. And you would have been a fine senator. I don't know if you would have beaten him, but you would have been a fine senator. But as we talk about America, I want to dig into Ukraine and national security, but I want to ask you a top line question. Sir, do you think the American public appreciates the magnitude of what is happening in Ukraine? I read the stories, we follow it, we talk to people who are there. I mean, the brutality and the scale and scope of the fighting that we're seeing daily. On a very basic level, America had a hard time understanding our own wars. Do you think the country understands how big this is?
Probably not. We haven't seen anything like this since World War II. And, I tell people I have 3 combat tours and then visited combat zones, Iraq, Afghanistan, you name it, over the years. I've never encountered anything like this. The longest battle I was in Vietnam lasted probably 7 days. The Gulf War, my division was in combat for 4 days. So what we're seeing in Ukraine is really unusual. This is a 800-mile front. This is massive amounts of artillery and casualties, arguably 300,000 killed and wounded in the 2 fighting components, tens of thousands of civilians murdered by the Russians in Ukraine. So it is appalling. And the consequences of Ukraine losing control, its democracy, its sovereign territory, would be catastrophic in the view of many of us, both to Western Europe and as a sort of an example to President Xi in China, what's possible in Taiwan. So there's a lot at stake in this, and there's an inadequate, I think, sense of understanding that, this isn't another Afghanistan, which was a counterterrorism operation gone bad. But this is vital to U.S. national security and that of our allies, meaning the Europeans.
You've been a great conscience on this issue, and I've seen all your comments, most of your commentary, and I always look to you for guidance. And one of my critiques, I think Biden has generally done a strong job here, and there's been a lot to commend him for. But I still feel like he made a Bush-like mistake a year ago at the State of the Union and in the subsequent conversations, and that he didn't really prepare America for how long and hard and expensive this was going to be. And he didn't make that case that it was going to cost a lot, it was going to take a lot, but it would be worth it. And here we are a year later, the fighting drags on. Can I ask you to help us maybe frame that up? Because now we're talking about F-16s, which is the latest issue in kind of a long string of mother may I's, where the Ukrainians have to keep coming back and say, can I have this? Can I have that? Do you feel like it's at the point now where America needs to open the floodgates? We need to send F-16s. We need to send whatever they need, or do we continue on this course of kind of a one-off series of conversations with supplemental funding and one piece rather than the whole kit and caboodle?
Well, you raise an important point. I've been in the National Security Council meetings for 3 administrations, as a number 3, as a number 2, and as a principal during the Clinton administration for various issues. And, the president's got tremendous support, brilliant people, the National Security Council, state, JCS, but they're capable of handling 3 issues at the same time. That's it. And then we get overwhelmed. And there's 1,000 issues out there on a given day. And the president's keenly always, all of them, aware that his legacy is what he's working toward. And that means don't escalate to a nuclear war. Don't escalate to a European-wide war. Don't get involved in, open electronic warfare, cyber warfare against the Russians against the rest of the world. So I'm sympathetic to his problem. Having said that, The worst possible outcome of the Ukraine operation would be to spend literally billions of dollars, 40 to 100 billion, and when you throw in the economic support, and then have them lose their sovereignty and have millions of Ukrainians flooding into Western Europe, and to have emboldened Putin to then go after the Baltic states or Romania or Poland, or to have Z conclude, hey, we can get away with this also. And that means at some point you have to take decisive action. And by the way, Russia has to pay a price. It's not enough to give them the best air defense system in the world and have them shoot down most of the terrible attacks on civilian infrastructure. At some point, Russia has to hurt, and not just mothers who losing their sons. So, I've said for the last year, we got to give these people a deep strike capability, lethal drones, ATACMS, F-16s. Probably they're harder to get to deliver the goods on. The maintenance chain is very complex. The training may be a year. Apache helicopters, it takes us 2 years to take some nice young man or woman in the US and turn them into Apache pilots. So those are tougher, but ATACMS ought to be there now. And we ought to encourage the Ukrainians with giving them the targets to go after the Russian army in the most painful way possible. We need to go after the Russian fleet out in the Black Sea, which is pounding civilian targets in Ukraine. So I think they've got to come to a crossroads here and decide, look, we're going to make this thing work.
You articulate it much more clearly than the White House does. and I think that's part of what's frankly been missing. I think that President Biden has struggled at times to communicate things with a point. And we've seen U.S. support. I was on a show recently and they said, why is U.S. support dropping for Ukraine? Well, U.S. support generally drops for wars over time, but you've also got people like Tucker Carlson and others banging away at least a percentage of this every day. The fighting in Bakhmut is ferocious right now. I want to ask you a question. I don't think I've asked anyone else, and I feel like I can ask you. Why have the Ukrainians not hit inside Russia? If I were them, and I was thinking about how to hurt Russia, to your point, I would be finding ways, either guerrilla or conventional, to strike inside Russia. It even amazes me that if we're holding them back, we've been able to do that. But in your perspective, why aren't they blowing things up all the time inside Russia? If I was a young Ukrainian, that's what I would want to do. How have they not done that yet, or why have they not done that yet?
Well, I think they've done some of it. They've clearly gone after deep targets to include the strategic air power that's firing cruise missiles into Ukrainian civilian cities. So, and they went after the Kerch Bridge, and they've gone after the fleet in Sevastopol. They don't have very many tools. They've got some fighter aircraft that I suppose on a one-way mission could strike, the Minister of Defense in Moscow. But they're also, I'm sure, extremely wary of giving Putin more arguments to mobilize his own people. But I think when we give them ATACMS, which I hope we do, 3 or 4 or 500 of them, the targets ought to be out to the matched 300-kilometer range of that weapon. And that means anywhere that the Russian military, air, sea, or ground power are attacking Ukraine are legitimate targets. Of course, the challenge is Putin. I've been an arms control negotiator for years in the JCS, dealing with the Russians, Ukrainians, you name it, nuclear, chemical, biological. I have never seen anything like the dangerous rhetoric out of the Russians. Courtesy of this great journalist in Kyiv, I listen to Russian state TV, translated subtitles every night. Mm-hmm. And the things that are said by members of the Duma, by generals in their armed forces, by Putin himself, are incredible to hear. Is it like, strike Berlin, Paris, London with nuclear devices, Washington, D.C., firing nuclear torpedoes that'll put a tsunami over all of the UK, which of course is nonsense. There's no possibility of Russia or any state surviving a strategic nuclear exchange. Why are they saying this? Why are they threatening to use tactical nuclear weapons? What are they going to do? Hit Kyiv and kill 60,000 civilians? What will that get them? Are they going to try and target a Ukrainian battalion in Bakhmut with a 20 KT weapon? None of this makes any sense. So it has, to some extent, I think understandably, intimidated both Zelensky and the US administration and the Western Europeans. Germany and France are wobbly on this whole, their electorates. So, it's been a challenge to think through this. If we allow any nuclear state to intimidate the US, the West, the democratic states into acquiescence to aggression, we are making a permanent error. But that's the president's job, to struggle with that. And so far, he's been, I think, partially intimidated by this unbelievable rhetoric out of the Russians.
I'm so glad you framed it up that way, because I think that really is an important part for everyone to understand. As we are a year later, everyone was concerned, if we did this, they would use nukes. If we did this, they would use nukes. And there, this kind of hostage situation that Putin had created with the entire world that worked to his advantage, right? They were worried about that terrible thing, and he did all kinds of other terrible things in the meantime. But can I ask you, sir, to pull back out? Obviously you mentioned Xi in China. There were reports this week that the Chinese were supplying weapons to the Ukraine, that now that may be walked back. I'm not sure what the latest is, but what is your prediction for how this plays out? If you were going to put it down in a piece of paper and lock it in a box, how long do you think this goes on in Ukraine? I know it's difficult to predict, but I feel like I can ask you better than anyone. And what do you think China will do in the next few years?
Well, China has now turned into a one-person dictatorship. Essentially, Xi controls the state. He controls the party. He controls a surveillance apparatus that dominates the Chinese people. He's got tenacity. He'll go after his opponents, no matter how small the issue. COVID, just astonishing change. China was never a democracy, but they did listen. They had internal struggles and factions of the party, and they were clearly turning into a successful capitalistic state with a lot more freedom than they'd ever seen in their life, all while that's going. So I think we're not too sure about China anymore. They're unlikely to want to get involved in Russia's war. I'd be astonished if they ever send a Chinese military person to take direct part in that struggle. But I can see them, Xi saying, hey, why don't we mire the US and the West down in this endless struggle? We'll give the Russians just enough artillery ammunition to keep them fighting until they finally rise up and do away with Putin. So it's hard to know where all this is going. From a strategic sense, Putin's blown it. He can't seize all of Ukraine. If he tries and looks like he's going to succeed, it would be very possible to see NATO entering the struggle, maybe with just air power. Right. But so he's got to be aware of that. By the way, if you have a secret agent inside the White House, inside Paris, inside London, you're not going to know how the West will react to things like a Russian tactical nuclear strike, or an attempt to seize all of Ukraine, or an attack on the Baltic states. We don't have a plan for that. When it happens, Putin will find out, along with the rest of us, what we're energized to do. And the power of Western Europe and the United States is so awesome compared to the rump state of the Russian Federation. Their economy stinks. It basically depends upon selling oil and natural gas. There's nothing else there anybody wants. Their economy is less than that of Italy, less than that of California, less than that of Texas. And it's getting worse. The economic embargo, this wonderful Professor Snyder up at Yale University points out that their economy is in the pits. So I think strategically, Ukraine's in a good position. But, Paul, you were a rifle platoon leader in combat. I've been a rifle platoon leader in combat, a company commander, a battalion advisor, a division commander. But I tell people, every time you give me a military equation, I'm going to think about it as a company commander in high intensity combat. And the Ukrainians can't keep this up forever. They're taking serious losses of their best people, men and women, killed, maimed. I think the economic disaster in Ukraine, they're more likely to be able to handle. But so at some point, we've got to step in and give them a technological advantage to force the Russians to negotiate. What that would look like is anybody's guess. Unlikely that the Ukraine will ever get back Crimea. That's just a personal viewpoint. But clearly Putin is in a disaster, and we'll have to find a way out.
Sir, as one thing I've tried to underscore to people who don't seem to appreciate the scope of this is, given the less than 5% of our overall defense budget that we've expended from the U.S., that we've been able to support the destruction of a significant percentage. You may know the exact percentage, 40, 50% of the Russian military capacity, which for our national interest seems like a pretty good return on investment. If we said 10 years ago, hey, we're going to spend 5%, 10% of our budget to knock out, a quarter or half of the Russian military, that would seem like a pretty good return on investment to our national defense and our national security. But as we have this discussion, there's still the forever war for the United States going on. There are combat operations in Somalia. There were wounded troops in Syria a few weeks ago, U.S. troops. Can you just talk about the AUMF, which is now being debated in Congress, finally, I think, overdue, and the other side of what is now America's not only forever war, but it's our hidden war. Most Americans aren't tracking on Ukraine. They're definitely not tracking on what U.S. forces are doing in Somalia, Syria, and other places. Can you give us your assessment of that and whether or not you think the AUMF will be gone?
Well, I tell you, I probably have a different view on AUMF.
Please.
Congress does not want to be held responsible for approving or disapproving U.S. military operations at all. It's all woofing. And I don't think the administration wants them to push them into that situation either. They're ill-equipped to do that. And so mostly they will make noises and hoot and hanny about it. And what we need to do is to elect presidents and the Senate in particular, who are people of wisdom and caution and education, and who always try and use the other elements of U.S. national power, our values, our covert action, our economic power in lieu of combat. But you almost have to cede this to the executive branch. And so I think, occasionally you'll see a Republican and a Democrat come together and say forever wars, and, who gave them the legal authority to do this? And the lawyer, as you know, lawyers in Washington, D.C., it's astonishing. The Department of Justice will have a legal position on a conflict. So will states' lawyers. So will defense lawyers. So will the White House Office of Counsel. It's just astonishing. And at some point, the politicians will say, hey, wait a minute, we got to do something to solve this problem, and they'll act. So AUMF, I think, is a false argument. If we don't like what the president is doing, we ought to run him out of office. Now, by the way, both Trump and Biden clearly ran for office. Trump may have changed his mind, but ran for office saying, I'm going to get us out of Afghanistan and Iraq. And they did. And it was a bloody-minded scene when we got out, but that was a legitimate political decision by the president of the United States. Then everybody turned on it and said, how dare you suffer this catastrophic withdrawal? By the way, Afghanistan, 130,000 people didn't chase us down to the airfield with bricks. they chased us down to the airfield and got on the planes. So I don't know. I think to some extent, Congress is dysfunctional. They can't do anything. They can't pass a defense budget until we're 6 months, 9 months into the year. Who ever heard of running a company with 70 employees and you didn't have a budget until your year was almost done? Congress can't approve people for public office. They can't get the Senate organized to vote on it. It's just, it turned into gridlock over every issue, both large and small. And so you got these sense of extremists dominating the primary voting system who are driving us toward governmental incompetence.
Sir, I always look to you for your military and defense analysis, but your political analysis is sometimes even more important to me because you understand and you articulate the merging of the two. And our national security and our overall national health is so crippled right now by the dysfunction in Congress. And it's something you've been shining a light on for a long time. And I thank you for that. I want to let you go. You're going to stick around for a couple extra bonus questions for our Patreon members. But you've been a tremendous voice for us during these hard times and during COVID, during Ukraine, during Iraq and Afghanistan. I'm so grateful for that. Can I ask you to just end with one question, sir? Any wisdom that you would want to share with your grandkids about navigating tough times in America? We've all gone through it. I think a lot of folks are tired, exhausted, frustrated. But any guidance or I don't want to ask you for a pep talk if it's not warranted, but just wisdom from you on getting through these hard times as an American.
Well, I'm sorry I don't have my dad still with me. Every time I get my guts on a turmoil of something U.S. government is doing or the man of the American people. Remember, we've had tough times before. The 70s were no picnic. Racism, opposition to the Vietnam War, burning down American cities, attacks on National Guard. So Dad would always look at something like this and he'd say, "Oh, come on, Barry, we've had worse times than this. We always get through this. Never bet against the American people." And I think he was right. Of course, I'd say, "When was it worst?" And he'd say, "Well, the Civil War was really, I need something more recent to work with than that." So I think, I've got 6 grandchildren. They're all the healthiest kids imaginable. They're all uplifting, positive, physically healthy, engaged, honest, non-drug using, a huge problem in our society also. But then you turn around and you go, I'm talking to you from Seattle. We got 11,000 homeless people out here, mentally ill, drug using. Last year, the country had 107,000 people die from drug overdose, a higher rate of loss than World War II. So our challenge in America is our politicians aren't very good. We're not putting the best and the brightest up there. We're not finding middle ground. We're not getting pragmatic solutions, but we will. We'll get through this. It's a great, powerful country, and it's a meritocracy, and there's opportunity out there. But it's tougher on some groups than others.
Thank you for your wisdom. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for your continued sacrifice and for your example. You're a great American. You've been a great source of stability for all of us during difficult times. And I really appreciate you taking time to come back on the program and all you do, sir. Thank you so much.
Good to be with you, Paul.
Stay vigilant, sir. Thank you.